Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all doing well, whether you are already here watching live or if you're catching the replay because you work a normal job. It's about 4 in the afternoon here on Friday, but I'm on spring break from my teaching job. Normally home by 4 anyway, but decided to do this one in the afternoon today just because I'm not around tonight. I am going golfing tomorrow, and then I'll have some other work to catch up on. I want to get a jump start on writing next week's video because it's going to be very strategy heavy on all things rookie drafts. So anyway, that's what the lineup is. That's why we're live right now. I have a couple of things, it looks like, in the chat to jump on. Not a lot. I have some stuff I want to talk about as far as some of the rookie wide receivers, some of my takeaways from specifically Jacob Sanderson's column, and then just sort of some thoughts about the wide receiver class. And then, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see where it takes us. Might be a little bit of a shorter one today. We shall see. Scotty, what's up? Amazing to see that you have made it to a live. I guess the afternoon is the time for you. I saw that you were streaming something on Discord, that you were streaming on Twitch, like Pokemon or something the other day. So maybe that's why you're busy a lot of the time during my other streams. Tristan, what's up? Happy Easter weekend. Absolutely. So, and happy week before the NFL draft as well. It's coming up quick. I'm excited. One thing that was asked, Nate said I should pull up Scadabo's 40 and time it with a stopwatch. I'm good on that, to be honest with you. He's an interesting guy, though. I don't really know what to make of Scadabo. What I'm hearing is that the NFL is not really into it, and that he doesn't have the quote-unquote juice. He definitely has that dog in him, but I don't know if he has the juice to make it work. But I almost want him to go day 3. Because I feel like his best case scenario anyway is to get thrust into a starting job via injury and then just dominate all the touches over a limited run of time, maybe half a season, and just put up all the fantasy points. So I'm almost kind of thinking maybe I just want him to go day 3 because then I can just draft him a bunch late in rookie drafts and stash him, as opposed to he goes day 2 and then I have to make a real conviction play and take him in the early to mid second. I don't know. I don't know what to make of him because on paper, he looks awesome. I mean, he's just an amazingly productive prospect, and I don't know what I'm watching on tape, but yeah, I certainly could see how a guy like that might have some trouble translating, given that he's not actually that big. He's only 219. He just has a really high BMI because he's short, and he's kind of a bowling ball, right? But I don't know. I'm not sure how well that will translate, or if a team's going to really want to run their whole backfield through a guy like that. So I don't know. Tough call on Scadabo. What's up, Yellow Dog and Helix? Listen, Helix, you said how to strategize and assess your team and know what future moves you should make. It's a very tough question to really boil down. And more importantly, if I tell you that, you'll stop buying team breakdowns, and then my channel will probably go bankrupt. So I don't know if I can really spill the tea on that one. No, but I mean, in reality, how to strategize and assess your team. I think when I'm looking at when I pull up a team right away for a breakdown, the first thing I'm trying to figure out is kind of two things. how much buying power does this team have, and how productive is this team right now, or like where would I expect this team to finish right now in season if no other moves were made. And that's kind of where the rankings come from Keep Trade Cut and Dynasty Daddy as well. They have ranks for that in terms of like total roster value and starting lineup value. I don't always agree with them. You know, so they can undervalue or overvalue certain assets, but they're a good starting point. And then I just sort of look at it in the context of the league settings based on my experience, because I do have like 25 teams at this point, and I've played like 5 or 6 years of Dynasty. So I can sort of look at a team and just in my head, I'm trying to decide how likely do I think it is that this team could make the playoffs? How likely is it that it could win the championship? Sometimes I'll go and look at some of the other strong teams in your league. Not that you can't beat those teams, but it does help to know if there are like real super teams or if it's more of a flatly distributed, strength across the league, because then it's easier to potentially get a bye. So I'm thinking about all that. And basically, like, if you're outside of the top 5-ish, 4 or 5 in roster value, I'm pretty comfortable saying like you want to be flexible about how you approach the following season. If you're like top 3 in buying power and you know that you have a loaded lineup, those are teams where I'm like, yeah, you can probably trade your future first away and it's okay as long as you're getting back a high-end asset and you're, being smart about it. When you have those teams that are kind of middling in value, I'm really careful about what I do with that pick, because if the season gets off to a rough start, I'm not going to try to dig that hole deeper and go and buy pieces to keep competing. Where I might do something like, if I have a super high value team that on paper should be really good, but I start off with a couple of losses, I'm okay kind of digging in a little bit, making some tactical purchases and trying to get back in the playoff race. But it's really risky to do that when you have a team that's already struggling with value, because the pieces you'd be trading for are probably pieces that are going to continue depreciating. So if you make that big effort to try to make the playoffs, scrape your way into the playoffs, and then maybe you get in and you lose in the first round, well, now that season is cooked, and you probably have to rebuild next year now because you dug the hole even deeper. So now you've lost 2 seasons effectively because you didn't know when it was time to quit. And so that's the thing where it can be tricky. I hate when people go and rebuild too early, but you can also wait too long, and then you can end up basically losing 2 seasons. And I remember making a really big mistake with this. One of my first seasons, I just wanted to make the playoffs because I hadn't played a lot of Dynasty. It seemed like it would be fun to get in the playoffs. I ended up trading my first for like Melvin Gordon and Mike Williams. And Melvin Gordon was like later in his career at this point. So I think he finished like RB 21 or something. Like he was like worse than what James Conner is now. And then Mike Williams was whatever, Mike Williams. I ended up trading my first for those guys. Didn't even help me really. I made the playoffs, lost in the first round, and I ended up having to go into a pretty big rebuild. So yeah, that's where I'm thinking is just mainly the decisions I have to make are about whether this team is going to contend confidently, whether it's going to contend tentatively with kind of an out towards a rebuild, or whether it's just going into a full rebuild right away. After that, the decisions that I'm making, it's mostly just about how I perceive players versus the market. So when I'm looking at a team where there's just a lot of players on it that I know that the market likes more than I do, somebody like a Rome Odunze, somebody like Jared Goff, I'm probably just going to look for ways to pivot off of those guys to my own personal preferences that I think are better bets at cost. And then, I'll make suggestions about positions to prioritize based on your league settings and stuff like that. But that's kind of the broad sense of like when I'm doing a breakdown, so I'm looking for. And I think if you can get those broad strokes right, you can kind of figure out the rest, or you can at least outsource the rest to, your favorite analyst. So that's where it stands with the team evals. As far as other stuff here in the member stream channel, one guy, I don't know how to say his name, N Kasau. He's not here, but he says he's going to watch the replay. He wants to know why Shedeur Sanders fell in the draft compared to Cam Ward. I know Cam has been the number 1 quarterback for the past couple months, but before that it was super close. Could it be that the market is irrationally underpricing Sanders due to media buzz? So I can't say that I really understand this. I'm actually going to pause for a second because there's some chat stuff I want to catch up on. Yellow says first or last, like Ricky Bobby. Yeah, so I don't quite adhere to this strategy, as you know. I think it's good to make the playoffs when you can, as long as you're not compromising yourself for future seasons. Getting a bye is definitely better. You want to try to get a bye, but I don't want to be sacrificing competitive years if I don't have to. But yeah, I mean, in general, like once you know that you don't really have the juice, and like a lot of times if you're fighting for a last playoff spot, unless you've just gotten really unlucky with matchups or injuries, you're probably not a real contender, and maybe you should just pack it in and try to get the 101. But yeah, I mean, you can see it this year, right? What's the difference between the 101 and the 102? It's like you have to offer like at least a first round pick to get there. So there's a ton of buying power edge that you typically get when you can lock up that 101 pick. So you don't want to wait too long. But anyway, Freelster says, I was watching the rookie mock, not realizing the stream had already started. Yeah, I mean, you could have started watching that like right after I posted it, and you might still be watching it because it's ridiculously long. I'm kind of worried I was rambling a little bit in that one. I didn't script as much as I normally do because I was like, I know these prospects. I'm just sort of like pontificating on different landing spots and stuff like that. And I feel like I got a little maybe overly analytical or repeated myself a lot, but hopefully the 37 minutes were actionable and interesting. And, you know, I'm excited to do the same thing once we know where these guys are actually going to go. Anyway, as far as Shedeur Sanders, I can't claim to understand why the NFL is changing their tune with him. I can't even claim to know exactly what Sanders is as a prospect. What I understand about Shedeur Sanders, and I've really not watched a whole lot of him because, again, I don't use my own opinion of quarterback play as part of my evaluation. I am completely outsourcing that job mostly to the NFL through draft capital. I'm looking at what is the upside of these guys via rushing. And then I'm taking, you know, opinions from some people that I trust, like Jacob Sanderson, like Pat Kerrane, people like that. I am not going to go watch Shedeur Sanders and say, like, act like I have any idea whether that guy's going to be good in the NFL. But from what I understand, that Colorado ran a really simplistic offense, basically spammed the same 8 or 9 plays over and over and over again. So the idea that Sanders is like a pro-ready quarterback, which was floated around for a while, one suspicion I might have is just that teams started to meet with him and realized, oh, maybe he's not a pro-ready quarterback because he didn't actually run a real offense in college. He just ran the same plays over and over again, which means he might not know how to read a defense like effectively, like running a real NFL scheme. And the whole selling point for him was that he was like this already made professional because his dad is Deion Sanders and because he's been, you know, born and bred to be a quarterback. If they brought him in and they're like, well, he doesn't really have physical tools. Sure, he's accurate, but he's not athletic. And he maybe if the mentals are lacking, right? If that's the biggest part for him. If the mentals are lacking or they didn't like what they saw in the interviews, I could see why teams would sort of sour on him and say, maybe this isn't the guy that we want to go all in on. So that could be one reason why he's falling. I almost feel like it's the opposite of the media buzz. I almost feel like he was overpriced because of media buzz, because Colorado was such like a, I don't know, sensationalized program with him at quarterback and with Deion and everything. And maybe as the process kind of developed, teams started seeing these red flags that maybe they were overlooking before. So I don't know. That seems like a possibility to me. But yeah, so that's one thing. I don't know. I think Cam Ward is just more interesting from a tool standpoint, obviously more interesting for fantasy now that he's going to go number 1 overall, for whatever it's worth. Jacob Sanderson really liked his film a lot more. I can't remember the name of the guy that was on the Late Round podcast. He had a quarterback model from over from like FanDuel or wherever he was. That guy also liked Cam Ward. So I don't know. I think that there are reasons to like him. But Scotty says Cam Ward feels like a trap. Less than quarterback class reputation fell on Sanders' shoulder at some point, and I've heard some wildly positive takes on Ward. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get out over my skis on him. But it's my intuition here at this point that he's going to come into the league a lot, not nearly as expensive as somebody like Bryce Young was. Bryce Young coming out as the 101, he was a second round startup pick. Ward looks like he's going to fit more into like the JJ McCarthy, Trevor Lawrence range of value. I think that's a totally fine place to take a quarterback like Ward. He's going to have a little bit of mobility, you know, at least on par with like a Lawrence or a Herbert. And, you know, he's going to have a good level of value insulation from that spot. I think starting at that value level as opposed to Bryce Young, I think it's a lot easier to foresee him gaining value without actually having to do anything all that spectacular. Whereas for whatever reason, Bryce Young was just viewed a lot more favorably, and he became priced up to a point where, as a guy without much rushing upside, was going to have to be tremendous to improve from there. So I thought Stroud was a much better bet than Bryce Young because I didn't see them that differently, and he was being priced way further down the board. I would say it's more like that with Ward, but you know, he'll probably end up being my 103 or my 104, and you know, I'll be fine with that. Yella says, I think they're afraid of his confidence and not being a yes man. I'll do whatever the coach says kind of guy. No other quarterback has had the upbringing he's had. I mean, maybe like, I don't think any of us are really in a position to make that assumption. I think there's plenty of stuff to nitpick, or at least things I've heard as nitpicks of his play on the field and his performance. I mean, he certainly takes a lot of sacks. He's lost a ton. His EPA loss per sack or something is like really bad. You know, again, didn't run a very complex offense, really just ran a lot of the same plays over and over again. I think it's totally possible that he's just being criticized for his actual play, but I have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. T, welcome to the stream. What's up? T says, I've always been low on Sanders. No wow factor at all when he was projected to be the first overall pick. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Dude just doesn't seem to have, he just doesn't have the aura for me, but I have no idea like if my aura radar has a good hit rate or not. So I'm not using that for the rankings. Nate, I already talked about Scatabo, actually. He was the first thing I talked about on the stream, so you're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning. But spoiler alert, I did not time his 40. I just talked about him as a prospect. Yella, what is the context here? Why did you say Matt Kelly? I don't know what that means. I mean, I know who he is, but I don't know what he has to do with this conversation. Nate says, Ward has a high real-life ceiling. He's just a goofball. I mean, as with most positions, other than maybe running back, I think that we are just overly confident in what we would consider upside. Like, yeah, I mean, he has arm talent, but I feel like he just, like, yes, players with big arms, we think of them as having high upside. In reality, like, as long as you hit a certain threshold, you have plenty of upside. Tom Brady had upside. You know, who's at the top of the quarterback rankings right now? Like, yeah, Josh Allen has a big arm. Mahomes has a big arm. Lamar has a pretty big arm. I mean, I guess to some extent, but like Joe Burrow's not really, you wouldn't look at Joe Burrow athletically and say, this is a guy with a high real life ceiling. You know, if you just were to look at him as a physical prospect, he had a high ceiling because he was incredibly productive in college. I guess if that's what you mean about Ward, then I could agree with you. But I do think in general, we kind of overrate the like arm strength stuff or whatever else, whatever other stuff people bring up with guys like Cam Ward. Yella, this is not the dude from the late round pod. It was not Matt Kelly. He was on today or like recently, but that was not the episode I was talking about. It was with this guy who worked at like Number Fire or FanDuel with JJ and has a quarterback model that he uses. I'm just going to pull up the recent episodes and see which one it was because it'll be near the top. Questionable quarterback class, Jim Sanis from FanDuel. That was the one. It was from April 1st. And he had Jackson Dart, I believe, at the top of his model, but he also talked very favorably about Cam Ward. So anyway, that was the one. Jim Sanis. Nate says, no, he just places stuff so well and can progress through things, very evasive at times. Yeah, I mean, okay, that's fair. Like I said, I'm not doing the breakdowns. So that those all sound like useful traits, and that's probably why he's going first round. Or I mean first overall. So, you know, I'm open to it, right? Like I'm open to it because we get this stuff wrong so often. I'm not going to be that picky about the quarterback that goes first overall if he's not going to be incredibly cost prohibitive in Dynasty like Bryce Young was coming out. Cam Ward's not cost prohibitive. I think for a first overall pick quarterback, if anything, he'll be more underpriced than overpriced. All right. So that takes care of the Sanders question. And great. There are no other actual questions in the show sheet or whatever you want to call it. So I just want to talk about some of my thoughts, kind of just scattershot stuff that I saved from Jacob Sanderson's wide receiver article. Now, this is technically paywalled. This is part of his Substack, but I'm just considering it an advertisement. I'm just going to share some of the stuff that he wrote up in his article. I definitely recommend his Substack if you like to read well-written, well-reasoned analysis. It's called Thinking About Thinking. But I just want to go over some of his thoughts. One thing that he points out, and I'm just going to go like one player at a time here, starting with Tet McMillan, because I had these in order of how he had them ranked. His thoughts on Hunter very much mirror mine. He's maybe a little bit more risk averse right now with him. He didn't come out and say like he's clearly the 102, but he's very high on him. But with Tet McMillan, one thing he pointed out that I think is really smart is when you're looking at contested target percentage, it's kind of a flawed stat. And he brings up a comparison where he says, if you had a wide receiver who had 50 targets with 10 contested targets versus a wide receiver with 100 targets, but 30 of them were contested, which one of them is better at getting open? Because the guy who only had 50 targets is going to have the lower contested target percentage, but the player with 100 targets had 30 more uncontested targets than the first wide receiver. So that very well could be the player that's better at getting open. So what he suggests is calculating what's called an uncontested targets per outrun, where you take total number of targets, you subtract all the contested targets, and then you divide it by routes run, uncontested targets per outrun. He doesn't provide like a full-on list of all these guys, but he did mention that McMillan's uncontested targets per outrun did rank 49th out of 268 wide receivers with at least 50 targets, and that was despite having a very high 13.7 ADOT. So that's totally fine. That's like well above average. That's in the top 20% of all wide receivers with at least 50 targets. And again, doing that at a very high ADOT where you're more likely to get a contested target, especially if your quarterback is garbage, which was the case. So I think that's a really good note on Tet. I'm basically not worried at all about the contested target side of things. Remains to be seen whether he can like truly win in the NFL as a downfield X receiver in the like somebody like a Brian Thomas or whatever. Because he's just not as much of a physical freak. But I think he has a pretty high floor. I don't think he's a boom bust prospect like some people are saying. I think that he is a pretty safe wide receiver prospect. T says, you wouldn't say a factor in that side of scheme quarterback play. I mean, if you mean uncontested targets per outrun, I would say it's no more a factor than the same factors that lead to contested targets. And I think that's really the main problem with contested targets is that it is very much impacted by things like scheme and quarterback play. Like you can be wide open deep and your quarterback throws the ball late and you get a contested target. And I've heard from Brett Whitefield, who's very high on Tet, that was the case, that he actually was wide open very often and his quarterback created contested situations. I think that's just another reason to be wary of any negative analysis that relies heavily on contested targets, at least when we're talking about a player who earned a ton of targets overall, and a lot of those were uncontested. Yella, I'm sure some people argue that. The truth is most wide receivers play against bad defenses. The key is that he played really, really, really well against bad defenses. And honestly, I think his strength of schedule wasn't actually that poor. It was like 64th percentile or something. So I don't know. I think he's really solid. Like, I really do. My biggest question with him is I'm not so sure how likely he is to hit a super duper elite ceiling, but you don't need that for him to pay off his price, at least as a rookie. So I'm probably in on him. I'm probably going to be in on him at his cost unless he ends up being like the 102, 103 in ADP. Frillster says, I think Brian Callahan is a quarterback's worst nightmare as a coach. The things he was saying about Levis to the media last year were rough. I mean, I didn't hear him saying anything bad about Joe Burrow when he was the OC in Cincinnati. So maybe Will Levis is the problem here. Like, I would really struggle to not say bad things about my quarterback if he was doing the kind of ridiculous things that Will Levis was doing on a weekly basis last year. But we'll see. I don't know. I mean, maybe he is just that kind of personality, but I tend to think Levis is a uniquely trying quarterback to have manning your offense when you're like an offensive head coach who's in his first season trying to make a good impression on the league, and your quarterback is just making an absolute fool of himself. That seems tough. So that was what he said about Ted. I liked that a lot. Then he talked about Igbuka. And Igbuka, he mentions this concept of the F wide receiver. So we have the slot wide receiver, traditional slot wide receiver. Then we also have the X outside and the Z, who plays like more off the line. The F wide receiver is a slot wide receiver with increased size and ability to affect the run and pass game. So it's like kind of what you would call this big slot archetype. So think of guys like Drake London, Chris Godwin, Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown, even Jawan Jennings, Khalil Shakir. He thinks Igbuka can be very well suited to that type of a role because he was successful against press coverage, 92nd percentile success rate against press coverage. He's an elite run blocking wide receiver. This is like one of his calling cards, that he's an elite run blocker. So he should be able to play outside on two wide receiver sets. Like, think about the reasons you would take him off the field if he can't handle press and if he can't block. He's really good at both of those things. So yeah, he's not necessarily a vertical threat. He didn't grade out very well on those type of routes, but I think he can still stay on the field for a team in two wide sets. And in the slot, I think he can absolutely dominate the same way that we've seen from guys like Godwin or Amon-Ra, just based on the production he had, based on his tools, his tape and everything. So I think he actually has a pretty good ceiling. And as everyone has said, he's definitely safe. I'd be really shocked if he was like a true bust wide receiver. That would be very surprising to me. Yella, I truly don't get this take at this point in the process. I totally understood it prior to his 2024 season, given what his draft capital was expected to be and how good his sophomore season was. I feel like it's just take lock at this point to keep him as wide receiver one of the class, especially when he's most likely not going to be a first rounder. You can totally say you like him at cost, but I don't think he's the wide receiver one in this class. I don't really see any reason to like him more than Tet, certainly not more than Hunter, and even Igbuka at this point. I do see the ceiling possibilities with him for sure. So he's tough. He's a tough eval, but I don't know. I think there's plenty of nervousness there too. I did share the Matthew Golden blurbs in Discord, but I am going to hit this real quick. He has the lowest peak yards per game of any first round wide receiver in the last 12 years. Lower peak. So his peak receiving yards per game is lower than Henry Ruggs, Philip Dorsett, Kelvin Benjamin, Quentin Johnston, Jalen Reagor, Brashad Perriman, John Ross. I mean, he is genuinely the least productive round one wide receiver that we have seen in the last 12 years. And he falls into a group where really only Calvin Ridley and possibly Xavier Worthy are hits. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to be bad. People, think that I'm saying he's going to suck. I don't know that I'm not saying that's the case. It's too small of a sample to even say for sure. When a wide receiver goes in the first round, we should care. But I think the key is this, which he says here. Golden inherently is a high risk player due to his production profile. So we know he's high risk because we can just see clear as day all the red flags in his profile. No matter how many dudes on Twitter tell me to watch the tape, those red flags are not going to go away. But Jacob says, I'm not as concerned about being beat by the ceiling if I wind up too low. I think it's possible he becomes an efficient vertical wide receiver 2 in the mold of Brandon Cooks, Jordan Addison, Tyler Lockett, or Emmanuel Sanders. If he does, he'll be a hit at his likely dynasty ADP. But it's also not a player I'll lose sleep over having passed on. And that's really where I sit. And I think I said this in the video. Basically, I just don't think he's going to become an elite fantasy wide receiver. Even in the worlds where he is a hit, where he ends up being worth the draft capital that the NFL spends on him, I don't see how he's ever commanding the type of volume that makes him a real wide receiver 1 threat. Like, he looks like Addison, maybe in his absolute dream scenario, he's Jalen Waddle. I don't know what's going to happen that's going to make me really, really upset that I didn't draft him. So I'm comfortable being a little bit behind the market and not saying I need to get this guy on my team. Nate, I think that this is fair. Yeah, Jameson Williams would be an example of a guy where I didn't really take him, and obviously it took him a long time to hit, so he lost a lot of value. But even if Jameson Williams had come out, let's take away one loss. Let's say his second season instead of his third season, he had the production he had last year. What am I really he was wide receiver 25 in points per game. Okay, I mean that's great. It's a player you don't mind having, but at the same time, it's not that hard to replace. So I just think you want to be weighing the risk versus reward. And I think that the particular risk reward quotient with Golden is especially bad. And so that's why I'm not that into him. All right, going a little bit further down, Trey Harris. Jacob seems higher on Trey Harris than me. I'm open to him being, he has him as his wide receiver 6. I'm open to him being that high for me. But personally, I would say I have him a little bit lower right now. He does point out one red flag though. So he has really impressive yards per out run numbers his last season. Everybody knows that. Over 5 yards per out run. His yards per team pass attempt and market share of receiving yards numbers are good, but not that elite. I suspect this is because he missed games. It doesn't say that it's prorated for games played. So that might be the reason for that. But Scott Barrett points out that Ole Miss averaged only 12 fewer passing yards per game in the games that Trey Harris missed. And Jordan Watkins, who is a projected undrafted free agent, actually averaged 120 receiving yards per game in the period that Trey Harris was out. So in other words, Harris was really efficient when he was in the game, but it seems more likely that it seems like a lot like it was a scheme thing more than just a Trey Harris thing. Who's to say? Some of the film people really like him, so I don't know for sure. But it does really seem like he was propped up by being part of a really good scheme that can make most wide receivers productive. At the same time, he has some appealing traits. His peak production, whether it's fake or not, was really strong. I think it's fair to take that shot in the second. I think the reason behind his ranking is more so that he sees the upside case more clearly with him than with other guys. All right. So just got to wrap this thing up here shortly. I want to talk about 3 more guys. And then unfortunately, I will have to get out of here a little bit quicker than I thought. But I appreciate you guys popping in to hang out. A lot more people than I might have expected. So this has been fun. Tristan says, Xavier Legette, good example of why first-round capital doesn't always yield that a player should be drafted in rookie drafts, despite the that's flags they present towards low fantasy production. Yeah, I mean, I was fine with the Xavier Legette's price because he was mid to late second round. That's very low risk when you're talking about a 206, 207 pick. I took Golden at 202 in my mock, and I could definitely see worlds where things go differently for other players, and I've got him at 112 or 201. But it's just about the cost versus the profile. That's the thing. And I think he's going to be priced up despite having a pretty poor profile. So that's the thing. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Ladd was clearly a better prospect than Leggett or Pearsall. Why those guys went in round 1 instead of him, I have no idea. Like, he would have been, I don't think it was landing spot dependent with him. I think he would have been incredible if he went to Carolina or San Francisco, and those teams just absolutely screwed things up, as did the Patriots taking Jalen Polk ahead of him. Anyway, the next guy was Jack Bech, and this was the guy that I was most interested in reading about because Jacob has Jack Bech as his wide receiver 7. And I don't know, I've kind of viewed him as like more of like a 3rd round rookie pick, kind of like a, throw a dart guy. But he's really high on him. And there's a few reasons, like context-based reasons. So Jack Bech did start playing tight end as a freshman at LSU. If you haven't heard already, he was on the LSU team with Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors when they were all freshmen, plus Kayshon Boutte as a sophomore, plus Trey Palmer. And he actually led that team in receptions as a freshman playing tight end. Then he gets switched to wide receiver. His production falls off a cliff as a sophomore. He transfers to TCU, isn't productive again as a junior. This year at 2024, playing X wide receiver, despite not being very fast and not having a good success rate on deep routes, he actually does break out, has a good season. He does that playing alongside Savion Williams, who's going to get some draft capital, and a guy named Eric McAllister, who should get some draft capital in 2026. And he had elite success rates in reception perception, 85th and 91st percentile versus man and press, 60th percentile versus zone. So good film stuff. Brett Whitefield also likes him on film. Good film eval. There's sort of an explanation for his poor production based on his kind of changing of positions. He also had an injury, I believe, as a sophomore, tightrope surgery or something. So all that's the case. And then Jacob makes the case for Bech being another one of these F wide receiver types because he is big. He can break tackles, and his weakest point is those downfield routes. So if he can succeed in the slot on those routes that he was really good on, with his size, he should get on the field a lot because of his size, his blocking ability, background playing tight end. Could be pretty interesting. So I get all that. I think the landing spot for him is going to be really important. Like in my video from today, in that mock draft, he went to the Chargers, and I pointed out that's a stupid landing spot because he won't be able to play in the slot there with Ladd McConkey. And also they took Colston Loveland in that mock. I don't like Bech if he's going to be purely an outside wide receiver. So I would need to see him go to a team probably in the 2nd round that is, lacking a slot wide receiver. Like if he went to the Giants or something in the 2nd round, I could totally see him supplanting Wan'Dale Robinson and being the 2nd target in that offense. That could be interesting for sure. And then finishing things up here with Higgins and Noel from both from Iowa State. He wrote them up together. He actually had them below Trey Harris. He had both of them below Jack Bech and below Alec Iomanner, which I thought was interesting. But he makes a pretty good point, which is that they are kind of correlated in that if they're both good, like if one of them is good, it's more likely the other is good because they basically had identical production this year. If one of them is bad and the other one was unable to surpass that player, then maybe they're both bad. The really fascinating things about Iowa State is that Higgins and Noel combined for over 4,100 receiving yards over the last 2 years, and no other wide receiver on their team had more than 260. So it's the most insanely consolidated passing game you've ever seen. They played out of a lot of heavy personnel, which does inflate receiver stats. When you have fullbacks and multiple tight ends on the field, wide receivers have an easier time drawing targets because those players are not as strong competition. So their stats might be a little bit inflated. Again, they were almost identical to one another, although Higgins was more efficient per route, comparing to Noel in the slot and comparing to Noel out wide. But Noel played more in the slot where it was a little bit easier to compile production. So their efficiency kind of evens out in that way. Noel does grade out better, like I pointed out in the video, in reception perception. He's graded higher by Brett Whitefield. However, big red flag for Noel, I don't know. Over the last 2 seasons, he only has 10 total missed tackles forced. That's crazy. Over the last 2 seasons combined, Luther Burden had 30 just in this season. Ted McMillan had 29 just in this season. So Noel, despite having these pretty good production numbers, 10 missed tackles forced, and he's operating at like a fairly low depth of target, or at least he's getting a decent number of screens and short area targets. Matt Harmon says that he went down on first contact 77.8% of his in-space receptions. That is a really high number. And so that does kind of hurt some of the projection for him at the next level. You know, he's a crazy good athlete, but if he cannot break a tackle, it's harder to project him as a smaller wide receiver playing a full-time role at the next level. And that almost makes him seem more like a Jayden Reed type. I know Jayden Reed's pretty elusive and can break tackles, so it's not a perfect comp, but the idea that he could have some limitation that keeps him from being a full-time guy in the same way that Jayden Reed has been unable to capture that full-time role, that is a concern for Noel. I would love to see him go in the second round to give me a little bit more comfort there. I'm still going to keep him in the same tier with Higgins, who also has red flags, with Io Manor. All these guys have red flags. I'm going to be looking for every excuse to rank running backs ahead of those players because they do all kind of freak me out in their own way. But I suspect somebody's going to get themselves a nice landing spot in the second round, and I'll get some shares. But it was a really good article. I think Jacob does a great job of identifying where the differences are between good real life wide receivers and good fantasy wide receivers. He really breaks it all down very logically and kind of looks at, you know, what is their role going to be in the real world, and how is that going to match up for fantasy? Like Trey Harris, he profiles as an X wide receiver. That could push him up the board because that's a valuable position in the league. But the truth is that to be a valuable fantasy asset as an X wide receiver, you have to be really good to earn a lot of targets. So it's going to be important for him to hit in a big way to make that huge impact. So things like that, you know, he understands some subtleties that I think are really helpful. I always learn a lot, even though I already spend a ridiculous amount of time on this stuff. I learn a lot from him and his articles, but hopefully that was helpful. Those are some thoughts on wide receivers. I am going to close this thing out here. Like I said, a little bit of a shorter stream, but if you guys have other thoughts or questions, you can drop them in the main chat. You can drop them in the member stream chat for next time. I don't know what day next week we'll do for the stream because of the draft. Maybe I'll go live during it. I don't know. It depends what else I have going on. Or maybe on Friday afternoon again, we can talk about day one if I have time and get ready for day two. I don't know. We'll figure it out. I'll keep you posted. Appreciate you guys coming to hang out here. I do see Tristan dropped one question. Let me just hit that one real quick. You're in a hard rebuild. Are you still drafting running backs or looking to trade down? If I'm in a hard rebuild, I'm kind of almost always looking to trade down because you want to spread out your bets more in a hard rebuild, because the more assets that you can add that have upside, the more likely you are to kind of hit big on somebody. You know, think of a Bucky Irving, a Tyrone Tracy kind of player. So in that sense, I would trade back. I'm not afraid to take running backs because if they hit in season, you can flip them. Somebody always needs a running back in season. So I would be totally fine to draft the running backs and just hold them, especially if they're backups, like in the third or fourth round of rookie drafts. You should draft those running backs there because those are lottery tickets that, first of all, they're not going to get hurt because most of them aren't going to be on the field. And they're already valued as if they're not going to play much. And then when they do break out, you can just trade them, you know, before they score really any points that hurt you. You can trade them to someone else for a profit. So I'm totally fine to take running backs no matter what, but I would be down to trade back, add more picks, and really load up. But I think it's a big mistake to start pivoting to like day 3 wide receivers instead of just taking the running backs, because those are just horrible bets to make most of the time. Anyway, that's going to do it, guys. I will talk to you soon. Have a great weekend. Have a nice Easter, and I will see you later.